Remember when COVID was a thing? Well, some who received the vaccine sure do. Almost 9,000 Americans have filed injury claims saying that the vaccine, all forms of it, caused them serious side effects. Now, few of these claims have succeeded, however. Reason Magazine's Christian Britschgi reports that for injuries related to the vaccine, the government's Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program has paid only eight of those claimants. A recent New York Times article explained why so little had been paid out, writing, quote, "The government's understaffed compensation fund has paid so little because it officially recognizes few side effects for COVID vaccines. And vaccine supporters, including federal officials, worry that even a whisper of possible side effects feeds into misinformation spread by a vitriolic anti-vaccine movement." Christian Britschgi, my colleague at Reason Magazine, joins us now to discuss. Welcome to Rising, Christian.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So obviously the New York Times has called more attention to this recently, but you've also written about the issue for a couple of publications. Tell us how, and this has come up in my conversations with you, tell us how, with the COVID vaccine in particular, the process for making some kind of claim that you were injured by it, it seems to actually differ from those of other previous vaccines.
Yes, so the government has two programs for compensating people with vaccine injuries. There's the long-standing vaccine injury compensation program that's existed since the 1980s. And this program provides a liability shield for pharmaceutical companies. And what it does is it allows those who are claiming an injury from a vaccine to effectively sue the government for compensation. This program is it's faster than normal civil litigation. It has a lower standard of proof, and so it ends up paying out about $200 million a year to those who've claimed a COVID injury vaccine. The government will also pay for your lawyers. There's pretty generous caps for damages. You can get compensation for pain and suffering. And again, this is a program for normal vaccines. The COVID vaccine program is entirely different. Not only are you not allowed to sue a pharmaceutical company for a COVID vaccine injury, you're not allowed to sue the government either. Instead, what you do is file a claim for compensation with this program, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. And that's an administrative process. Basically, bureaucrats at the Health and Human Services Department look at your compensation form and decide whether or not they want to pay you. It's also worth noting that the standard of proof under this program is far higher than what it is under the normal vaccine compensation program. And so as a result, effectively, very few people have gotten compensated for COVID vaccine injuries. I think it's about a dozen people have been paid out collectively $40,000 in damages. And again, that's versus the $200 million or so that the standard vaccine compensation program pays out.
Can you give us a sense of what makes the burden of proof higher in the COVID vaccine cases as compared to other types of vaccines?
Yeah, sure. So it's just the language in the different programs. So under the VICP program, the standard compensation program for vaccines, it's, I think, a preponderance of evidence. So basically, if it's 51% likely that your injury came from a vaccine, the government will pay you compensation. There's also things called table injuries, where basically, if you have gotten this injury after having a vaccine, it's presumed that the vaccine caused that injury. Now, with the CICP program, I'm forgetting the precise language, but it's something like the weight of all credible, compelling scientific evidence is what's required for you to show that you got an injury from a COVID vaccine, which is a far higher standard of proof, particularly when you consider that these vaccines, because their approval was expedited and they've just been around for not nearly as long, we just have much less data about what their health effects might be. So, when it comes to trying to prove anything in a medical setting, proving anything is very difficult. So what standard of proof you require is crucial. And the COVID vaccine program, again, is an incredibly high threshold of proof.
So who set this program up this way? Obviously, this legal regime must have come into existence subsequent to the vaccine rollout. Who were the relevant decision makers? Is this actually something Congress at some point weighed in on, or the president, or is this a administrative action undertaken by HHS or the CDC? Who are the relevant players here?
Yeah, so the history is actually really interesting. So the CICP program got started as a piece of war on terror legislation back in 2005. It was passed as part of the Defense Appropriations Act that year. And the idea was basically If you have an anthrax attack or something like that, you're going to want companies to produce maybe untested countermeasures as quickly as possible. And one way you could incentivize them to do that is to give them pretty strong liability shields. But this was always envisioned as a small program that would respond to kind of one-off events. But then when the COVID pandemic happened, the vaccines or countermeasures for the pandemic were quickly declared part of the CICP program. And then, before the vaccines were even invented. And so the vaccines then, we've since given vaccines to hundreds of millions of people in the United States. And, any sort of medical treatment you do, there's going to be some percentage of people who suffer adverse reactions, side effects. All of those got shifted into this program that was always intended to be small and one-off. So that's where it came from.
And what rationale is there for the COVID, the handful of successful COVID vaccine claimants, injured claimants, getting such a small damage amount as compared to some of these, pre-existing vaccine payouts? Are their harms actually less, or is there any justification that's been given for why their injuries only are worth a few $1,000s as compared to the large sums that other vaccine injured people receive?
Sure, absolutely. So we don't know exactly the government's justification for why it's rewarded some people, why it hasn't rewarded others. Those determinations are, confidential. Again, this is not a court process where we might get some sort of public record of why the government's decided these things. It's basically, CICP and HRSA, the administration that administers it. It's kind of a black box. It's where in the VICP program. There's also established rates of compensation, and also it pays out for pain and suffering as well, which means that you'll get higher overall rates of compensation. In CICP, the caps are much lower, and it doesn't pay for pain and suffering. It doesn't compensate attorneys' fees either, and so all those contribute to it paying out much lower rates of compensation. Additionally, most of the people who've been compensated under the program have been for myocarditis, heart inflammation, which for a lot of people will the effects will subside after a while, and so it's difficult to show massive lasting injuries. Although there have been, I should mention, there have been lawsuits from people claiming vaccine injuries who've had terrible side effects, terrible conditions, who haven't been compensated by CICP. And again, it's because the program is a bit of a black box. We really don't know what the government's reasoning is for either not compensating them or still, continually waiting and processing their claims. So.
I mean, the Times says that as of April, 13,000 vaccine injury and compensation claims have been filed. Only 19% of those have been reviewed. So that's about 2,500 or so. And then of those, only 47 were deemed eligible for compensation. So it does seem like a significant part of the problem is that these claims aren't even being reviewed in the first place. Is that a staffing issue? Is that a funding issue?
So primarily I would say the fact that the program is taking so long to adjudicate these claims or to address these claims, it is largely a staffing issue. Again, this was a tiny program before the COVID vaccines were placed into it. I think it received something like 500 claims prior to the pandemic. So it was this very small program that then all of a sudden had to deal with this massive onslaught of, injury claims, what have you. And again, regardless what you think about the efficacy or safety of the COVID vaccines, you give something to 200 million people, many thousands of whom are going to claim some sort of injury. And so the program was just not set up to deal with it. Already the VICP program, which is longer established, is better resourced, has a whole, runs through federal claims court. That program is also under or over capacity, is something vaccine injury advocates have advocated for expanding the program. And so those issues are multiplied by 10 to 100 for the CICP program.
Well, right, because this is a vaccine that, I think like 2/3 of all Americans have gotten, something like that. I don't remember the exact percentage. It's a majority of Americans have gotten a COVID vaccine or multiple vaccines. To have that be in the program that was for like, what do we do about weaponized anthrax, the smaller war on terror program as you described, versus being in the program that handles all of the routine vaccines that hundreds of millions of people get every year, that children get, that obviously just makes absolutely no sense, and is really fascinating that it links back to how we always figure out that these war on terror programs that we signed off on years ago are end up still being used and applied in ways we never could have imagined years later. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been bills introduced to try to shift people folks filing COVID vaccine claims from the CICP to the VICP. Those haven't gone anywhere. Though patients claiming a vaccine injury have also sued HHS, saying that their rights to a jury trial have been taken away from them. But yeah, this is a great example of unintended consequences, I think. And basically, you pass legislation for a crisis, then the crisis comes and it turns out the program you set up is totally inadequate to deal with it. I think this is a great example of that.
Very informative. Christian, thank you so much for joining us to go over that.
Yep, thanks for having me.